for. But the fire is so
Well, it certainly is. If you're up in the Washington, D.C. area today, the weather outside is frightful there, so much that the federal government, for the most part, shut down today because of yet another snowstorm moved into that area. I'm sure the folks really don't mind a day off. 10 to 1, a lot of them are out shopping because they got the day off. Hey, but listen, you'll be happy to know that our senators were at work today. In fact, Senate Democrats, according to the Associated Press, today approved a key judicial nominee from President Barack Obama, the first nomination cleared since the weakened Senate filibuster rules. What that was all about, basically now, the Democrats applied the nuclear option, so-called nuclear option, which allows for them to pass on a simple majority, in particular, the president's nominations to the court. And today, the Senate voted 56 to 38 to approve Washington lawyer Patricia Millett's nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. Now, she has a reputation of being extremely liberal. It gives the Democrats a 5-4 majority on what is seen as one of the most powerful courts in the country because it handles the rules on White House actions and appeals on the legality of federal agency rules. Now, we know President Barack Obama has been using executive orders and changing rules to get around opposition he has faced in Congress. And one of the areas that he has been using his executive power, and there are certainly questions as to whether illegally he is using those, is in the area of illegal immigration. And we are well aware that he has used it to give a pass on deportations of young people who are in this country illegally. And now apparently we are getting reports of a new initiative that the president's going to get involved with, which would allow millions more of illegals to stay in this country. And even though some people don't like to use the term amnesty, that's the direction we appear to be heading more and more. And to talk about that with us today is Dan Stein, who is with the Federation of American Immigration Reform, or FAIR. Dan, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
All right, Dan, you've written articles on this. It's a new initiative called Parole in Place. So what is our president up to now with regards to appeasing those who want to give amnesty to millions of illegals?
Well, this administration, of course, is ideologically opposed to immigration controls, and they make no bones about it. The president has made it clear he doesn't want a blanket amnesty and reward program for people who broke the law, and naturally he has used a series of staged executive orders and rule changes and operating instruction memos to make these changes. Naturally, I've been monitoring the situation going on 30 years, more than 30 years now, actually, and I know for a fact that Congress has specifically tried over and over again to make sure that the president and the executive branch can only use parole powers in very limited case-by-case situations. In fact, ever since the 1959 Cuban Revolution, Congress has, every time it's had an opportunity to legislate on immigration, it has worked to try to narrow parole. And the reason, of course, is that, the commander-in-chief and the executive, the president, has certain very core constitutional responsibilities, which include defending the country, defending our borders, dispatching armed forces. These are fundamental enumerated powers in the Constitution. And immigration and border security is a very core function of the executive. And under our Constitution, the Congress legislates, and then the executive carries out those legislative commands. Well, normally the judiciary has been quite deferential to Congress and says, look, Congress makes the rules and the executive has to faithfully adhere to those rules. Well, this administration continues to concoct these very creative legal interpretations of various loopholes, including parole. And increasingly what they're basically doing is saying, instead of, well, we have to make these determinations on a case-by-case basis for individuals in extraordinary situations, we're just going to establish basic classes of people. We're just not going to bother deporting them anymore. And then they give them documents. Well, most recently they've used this term parole in place, which doesn't appear anywhere in the statute, but it's designed, what it does is actually takes the legislative change Congress made a few years ago to try to narrow the abuse of parole and actually turns it on its head and makes it a whole basis for a new class of illegal aliens. And that the people, a lot of people say, well, how come nobody can sue to stop what they're doing? We've always known at FAIR that the country was in danger of a rogue executive usurping the constitutional role and essentially giving out residence in this country in exchange for political promises and power. And it's the right to live in this country is really a public benefit that only the American people can bestow through Congress. Well, in the hands of an unprincipled executive, you have somebody who's essentially giving away the right to live in this country for political purposes. And there was the DACA group. These are people who were brought here when they were young. And, of course, these would include people up to 34. And now they expanded it to people who have relatives who are in the military, people who would have had to leave, if they had to leave the country because they entered illegally, would have been barred for 3 or 10 years, and so they don't have to leave. And now people who are relatives of people who came in the visa waiver program, basically through this gradual process, he's trying to include everybody here illegally, unless you are a terrorist or a serious violent felon.
Dan, I just for our listeners' sake, let's pull over here and try to clarify some things. So we know, number one, Congress, as you pointed out, by the Constitution, makes the laws. The president and the executive are supposed to, by the Constitution, carry out those laws. But we have seen now a president who believes that he has the right to say, for instance, he said, I don't like the Defense of Marriage Act, so we're not going to enforce it. He and his Attorney General, Eric Holder. We saw him apply much the same thing in other areas of the law. I'm just going to change don't ask, don't tell. I don't like that. We've seen it now with Obamacare. This is his prize legislation. And he has changed the law. Despite the fact that he has said publicly it's the law of the land, and I don't care what the Republicans do, it's the law of the land, but then he has changed aspects of Obamacare. And now he's doing the same thing with immigration law in this country. As you pointed out, he has done it for young people, kids, younger people, college-age kids who are in the country illegally because of what their parents entering illegally. But now, specifically, what I want to get to, and some people may not understand this, Dan, is that we have members of the military who have legally joined the military, but they're not citizens of the country. Is that clear? Is that correct?
Or they may not even be in the country legally.
Okay. But they are allowed to enter. Now, they can't be officers, I understand. It's a visa waiver program. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a different provision of law, but under the visa waiver program, this is something to promote tourism. People who are allegedly from low, fraud risk countries come in without a visa and get to stay for, a certain period of time. And these new rules allow their relatives essentially to stay. It's more rule bending. I mean, it's, the assumption is if you're going to give people a visa waiver opportunity that there isn't going to be illegal immigration from that country. But this new rule seems to institutionalize the idea that there will be.
So one way or the other, this president, who has been an advocate for what he calls immigration reform, but in reality, what certainly conservatives call amnesty, he is pushing this through with or without Congress.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, in fact, let's drill down on this amnesty question. The term amnesty, of course, means forgive and forget. Now, normally, when people talk about an amnesty, historically it means that you're not going to prosecute for, say, a criminal violation or some wrongful deed. But in the immigration context, that would essentially be the government not prosecuting you for coming in illegally or using fraudulent documents and giving you the opportunity to leave the country without being prosecuted. That would be an amnesty. It's actually compounded because you're not only not prosecuting people for a series of law violations, you're actually giving them what they broke the law to get in the first place, which is, of course, lifelong residency in the U.S. and attractive citizenship and petition rights for relatives as well as, for your children. It really is much broader than that. What the Obama administration is trying to do is allow people to force their way into the country, allowing foreign governments, the immigrants themselves and others, greedy, unscrupulous employers to decide who gets to immigrate to this country, and he wants to do it for the pure partisan purpose of knowing that many of the immigrants are going to vote heavily Democrat in their first 10 elections.
I haven't heard much in the way of opposition coming in this parole in place, the latest initiative of the president, if we want to call it that. I'm not hearing much opposition from the Republicans on this.
It's basically the Republicans they're a party that are underwritten by Wall Street. Rank and file Republican voters, of course, are very upset about what's been going on. But the party, of course, gets an awful lot of major corporate funding, and they are, always going to respond to who's contributing the money. And what we see right now in the Republican Party is that there's an internal struggle. You've got people fighting the good fight, like Senator Vitter and Senator Sessions, Lamar Smith from Texas, Representative Steve King from Iowa, and then you have pressure coming from these bigwigs in the corporate wing of the Republican leadership, like Karl Rove and the Bush faction that controls the party. They're trying to, jam this amnesty through. Now they claim it's because they have to, get the Latino vote, but the real reason is that there's a lot of employers who willfully violated immigration laws, smuggling, illegal recruitment, pattern and practice hiring. And if you look at the Senate immigration bill, what you see is there's a whole lot of waivers for past criminal activity in immigration proceedings. So you have this unholy alliance between the far left that wants an amnesty for partisan purposes and the corporate wing of the Republican Party that just wants the cheap labor and doesn't want to be held accountable, conspiring. It's kind of like the elites against the American people. How can you explain how there could be on a big agenda item in Congress to pass a mass amnesty bill when we have the lowest labor force participation in decades, when the middle class is disappearing, when Americans are struggling to make ends meet, when we're facing all these fiscal challenges? What would be the rationale behind opening the floodgates to millions more foreign workers? And yet that seems to be the order of the day. And, the media, obviously your show is an exception, but the media, they're all into this crazy Senate bill, the one that Chuck Schumer and John McCain crafted.
Mm-hmm. Does it distribute all to that the religious community, evangelicals, and others have also become part of and joined with President Barack Obama in calling for this amnesty plan?
Well, yeah, and of course the question of how authentic those organizations are and whether they're representative of their members or rank and file is a question. There's some evidence that George Soros is funding a lot of these organizations which take on the name of evangelical. But historically, the evangelical community has been very firm in its defense of obedience to the rule of law, respect for the rule of law, the importance of sovereignty and border security as an important function that enables our fundamental liberties. There's really not a lot of examples in world history of a country that loses control of its borders and survives. And yet, a lot of people are pushing this bill because there's a lot of money behind it, but a lot of the people pushing it don't fully understand the implications of what's in the legislation. If this bill passed, the Senate bill, the one that passed earlier this year, were to become law, this country would never be able to control immigration in the future. It would literally fatally hamstring our ability to determine who should have the right to come into this country and who should not. We're all for the spirit of Christian generosity. We want to be compassionate and leverage our philanthropy in the most effective way possible. But losing control of your country's borders is not an effective form of philanthropy. It is essentially, undermines the framework by which we project our philanthropic impulses in an effective way, because it overwhelms our public system, it overwhelms our public benefits programs, makes it impossible to plan everything from public education to infrastructure and everything else. You can't have effective and good government unless you control your borders. And yet, if the president were denying the right to live, the people who had the right to come in, if he were saying, you can't come in even though the law says you have a right to, you can bet the ACLU would be in court in 5 minutes. And yet under our current legal precedents, if the president were to turn around and say, I don't care what the law says, I'm just going to let 20 million people come into this country and live, no court in the country will allow a plaintiff to try to get even a declaratory statement about the legality of it. And, and this recently, the ICE union, these are the Immigration Customs Enforcement employees, were saying, hey, this administration is lawless. They are absolutely lawless. This president is violating the fundamental terms of his oath of office, and they took the extraordinary step of filing a court case in federal court to try to stop him. And the court said, well, what the president's really doing is illegal, but you guys need to pursue your remedies through the Civil Service Act before you ever get to court. And naturally, that gives the administration a pass. This is the same administration that sued Arizona and has sued any state that has even tried to set up cooperative immigration enforcement programs to work with the executive branch to enforce immigration law. I mean, this is absolute insanity.
Dan, you're with the Federation of American Immigration Reform. Do you have a website people can go and get some more information on this?
Sure do. Yeah, keep up with what's going on, and glad to have you come aboard. It's www.fairus, F-A-I-R-U-S, fairus.org, O-R-G.
Dan, thanks for joining us today. Dan Stein of the Federation of American Immigration Reform. So much news going on today. Would like to hear from you. 888-589-8840. 888-589-8840. You're listening to AFA Today. Fred Jackson sitting in for Kevin McCullough today. Like to hear from you as we come back to our phones in 2 minutes.